I knew something was wrong before I even got out of the truck. After 20 years of ranching, you develop a feel for your land the same way a parent knows when something's bothering their kid. And the moment I turned onto the dirt road leading to my south pasture, that feeling hit me right in the gut. The grass wasn't dead yet, but it wasn't right either. It had that dull, dusty look that only shows up when water stops flowing where it's supposed to. 2 weeks earlier, I'd left eastern Colorado for a cattle auction outside Albuquerque, figuring I'd be gone maybe 12 days. Everything was running smoothly when I left. The irrigation channel feeding my lower pasture had been doing its job for decades, carrying water across a narrow strip of land that now happened to sit beside one of those brand-new master-plan subdivisions developers love building on old farmland. Back when my father was alive, nobody cared about that channel. It was just part of the landscape. The easement had been recorded long before most of the people now living nearby were even born. It wasn't controversial. It wasn't disputed. It simply existed. Or at least it did until I came home. I parked beside the barn, checked the cattle, and immediately noticed several of them crowding around a stock tank that should have been overflowing. Instead, the water level sat several inches lower than normal. My ranch hand, Travis, came jogging over looking nervous. That alone got my attention because Travis wasn't the nervous type. This was a guy who once stitched his own hand after getting cut on barbed wire because he didn't want to drive 40 minutes to urgent care. "You need to see this," he said. No explanation. No small talk. Just those 5 words. We climbed into the side-by-side and followed the irrigation ditch south. The farther we went, the drier everything looked. At first I thought maybe a tree had fallen across the channel or somebody upstream had a pump failure. Then we rounded the bend, and I actually laughed because my brain refused to process what I was seeing. There, sitting directly across the mouth of my irrigation ditch, was a brand-new cedar privacy fence. 6 feet high, perfectly straight, fresh stains still shining in the afternoon sun. For a second, I genuinely thought I was looking at the wrong place. Then I spotted the ditch disappearing beneath a pile of packed dirt and construction debris. My water hadn't slowed down. It hadn't been redirected properly. Somebody had literally buried the thing. I climbed out and walked over in disbelief. Attached to one of the fence posts with a plastic zip tie was a printed notice. No signature. No company letterhead. Just a generic statement saying the drainage channel had been modified for structural safety compliance associated with ongoing development improvements. I read it twice, then a third time. The more I read it, the angrier I got. Structural safety compliance? That ditch had been there longer than the subdivision, longer than the roads, longer than the clubhouse with its decorative fountain, longer than every one of those matching houses lined up like they came off an assembly line. Travis looked at me and asked the question both of us were thinking. Can they even do this? I didn't answer right away because I already knew the answer. No, they absolutely could not. But standing there looking at that fence, I also realized somebody had convinced themselves they could get away with it. That bothered me even more. You see, most people think ranchers spend their lives arguing over cows and weather. The truth is we spend a lot of time protecting paperwork, water rights, grazing rights, easements, boundaries. Every piece of paper represents somebody else's attempt, at some point in history, to take something that didn't belong to them. My father taught me that lesson when I was 12 years old. He used to keep copies of land records in a fireproof safe, and he'd tell me, "Son, out here your land is only as safe as your documents." Standing in front of that fence, I could practically hear his voice. I went back to the house that evening and pulled out a thick folder from my office cabinet. Inside were 30 years of records, survey maps, county filings, water board approvals, photographs, maintenance logs, every single document connected to that irrigation easement. By midnight, my dining room table looked like a courtroom exhibit. The more I reviewed the paperwork, the more obvious it became that this wasn't some misunderstanding. Somebody at that development had looked directly at a legally recorded easement and decided it was inconvenient. They didn't ask permission. They didn't negotiate. They didn't even leave a phone number. They simply erased it and hoped nobody would fight back. That's when my anger turned into something else entirely. Patience. Because if there's one thing I've learned after decades on a ranch, it's that panic helps the person who caused the problem. Calm helps the person holding the evidence. The next morning, before sunrise, I called an attorney who specialized in agricultural property rights. By lunchtime, she had reviewed every document. By sunset, she called me back and said 7 words that changed the entire direction of the story. Mr. Dalton, they just made a huge mistake. And sitting there at my kitchen table, staring out at a pasture that was slowly drying under the summer heat, I had a feeling the people behind that fence had no idea what was about to happen next. The following morning, I drove into town and met my attorney, Claire Bennett, at her office just off the courthouse square. Claire wasn't the kind of lawyer who impressed people with expensive suits or dramatic speeches. She impressed people because judges listened when she talked. By the time I arrived, she already had copies of my easement filings spread across her conference table along with satellite maps, county surveys, and a stack of legal precedents thicker than a phone book. She tapped one of the documents and said, "This easement is about as protected as they come. Whoever approved construction over this either never checked the records or assumed you'd roll over." I smiled. I've been called stubborn before. She smiled back. Good, because they're about to find out what stubborn costs. By noon, she filed an emergency injunction for obstruction of a recorded easement, interference with agricultural operations, and destruction of protected access infrastructure. At the same time, I started making calls of my own. I contacted the County Water Authority, the State Agricultural Board, and a property rights association that had been fighting similar battles across the region for years. What surprised me wasn't how interested they were. It was how quickly they responded. Apparently, developers ignoring agricultural easements had become a growing problem, and my situation happened to land on several desks at exactly the right time. Within 48 hours, inspectors were reviewing documents, requesting site visits, and asking questions the subdivision management suddenly didn't want to answer. Then came the first phone call from the developer's legal team. The attorney introduced himself with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to settling problems with paperwork and money. "Mr. Dalton, I believe there may have been some misunderstanding regarding the drainage modifications." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window toward my pasture. "A misunderstanding?" I asked. "You buried my irrigation channel under a fence." He cleared his throat. "Well, our client believes the channel may have presented certain safety concerns." I couldn't help laughing. "The channel was there before your client bought the property." There was a long silence. "Perhaps we can reach a mutually beneficial resolution." "We already have one," I said. "It's called restoring my easement." The call ended shortly afterward. That evening, Claire called and told me the developer had hired one of the larger law firms in Denver. Apparently, they were beginning to understand the situation wasn't disappearing. A few days later, I finally met the man responsible for all of it. His name was Preston Hale. He couldn't have been more than 35. Perfect haircut, perfect watch, perfect boots that looked like they'd never stepped in mud a single day in their lives. He arrived at my ranch driving a luxury pickup cleaner than most operating rooms. I was repairing a gate when he walked over wearing the kind of smile that belongs to people who've spent their entire lives getting their way. "Mr. Dalton," he said, extending his hand. "I wanted to come personally and clear the air." I wiped my hands on a rag before shaking it. "Then clear it." He laughed politely. "Look, I think this whole thing has gotten bigger than it needs to be." "Funny," I said. "That's exactly what happens when somebody blocks a rancher's water." He ignored the comment and continued. "We're prepared to offer compensation for any inconvenience." Inconvenience. That word stuck in my head. I looked past him toward the drying pasture. "A flat tire is an inconvenience," I said. "Losing water for 200 head of cattle in July isn't." For the first time, his smile slipped. "Not much. Just enough. Let's be realistic." "I am being realistic. You know litigation can take years. So can drought." He stared at me for several seconds before trying a different approach. "You don't seem like a man who enjoys courtroom battles." "I don't." "Then why not settle this?" I shrugged. "Because you're not offering a settlement. You're offering hush money." That ended the meeting. He climbed back into his truck looking considerably less confident than when he'd arrived. What neither of us knew then was that events were already moving beyond lawyers and court filings. A local reporter had heard about the dispute through one of the county inspectors. She contacted me asking for an interview. Normally, I avoid cameras whenever possible. Ranching teaches you to value privacy. But when she explained what kind of story she wanted to tell, I agreed. A week later, a drone crew flew over my property. They captured footage of the south pasture turning brown under the summer heat. Then they crossed the property line and filmed the subdivision. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side sat cattle searching for water. On the other side stood a brand-new community clubhouse surrounded by green landscaping and a decorative fountain spraying water into the air 24 hours a day. The segment aired on regional television that Friday night. By Monday morning, everything changed. The story spread across social media faster than anyone expected. Local residents began sharing it. Farmers shared it. Ranchers shared it. Even people from neighboring states started commenting. The headline wasn't complicated. Wealthy development blocks historic ranch water rights. It was the kind of story that made people pick sides immediately. Then the homeowners started asking questions. Potential buyers called sales offices wanting to know whether the subdivision was involved in an active agricultural lawsuit. Existing residents wanted updates. Investors wanted explanations. Lenders wanted assurances. Nobody likes uncertainty when millions of dollars are involved. Suddenly Preston Hale wasn't just dealing with me anymore. He was dealing with nervous stakeholders, angry customers, and lawyers billing by the hour. Claire called one afternoon, sounding almost amused. "You won't believe this. Try me. Their title insurance company just got involved." Now that got my attention. Title companies hate unresolved property disputes. They especially hate recorded easement disputes. The entire purpose of title insurance is to avoid surprises attached to land ownership. If a major easement issue exists, it becomes everyone's problem. That's bad for them, isn't it? I asked. Very. Over the next 2 weeks, pressure mounted. Court dates approached. More inspectors visited the site. Internal emails surfaced during discovery showing that at least one project manager had warned against building over the easement. Somebody ignored the warning. Somebody decided it would be easier to ask forgiveness than permission. Unfortunately for them, forgiveness wasn't for sale. Then one evening Claire called again. This time her voice carried a different tone. "They're ready to negotiate." I sat down at my kitchen table where this whole fight had effectively begun. What are they offering? Fence removal. Full restoration of the ditch. Repair costs. Damages. I looked out the window toward the dark outline of my ranch. A month earlier I probably would have accepted immediately. But things had changed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized restoring the old ditch wouldn't solve the real problem. The real problem was that somebody could try this once. Which meant somebody could try it again. Tell them no, I said. Claire paused. You have something else in mind? I smiled. Actually, I do. Because while Preston Hale thought this battle was about getting my water back, I had started thinking several moves ahead. And the proposal I was about to make would leave him with only 2 choices. Accept terms he hated or risk watching his entire development sink deeper into a legal disaster that was growing larger by the day. A few days later we met in a conference room overlooking downtown Denver. On one side of the table sat Preston Hale, 2 attorneys, a representative from the title company, and several people who looked like they hadn't slept well in weeks. On my side it was just Claire and me. The funny thing about leverage is that it doesn't always look impressive. Sometimes leverage is just a folder full of documents and the patience to let other people create their own problems. Preston started the meeting by sliding a settlement proposal across the table. It included removal of the fence, restoration of the irrigation ditch, reimbursement for damages, and a confidentiality clause. Claire didn't even pick it up. I glanced at the first page, pushed it back, and said, "No." The room went quiet. One of the attorneys blinked. "Mr. Dalton, this exceeds what most courts would likely award." "Maybe. Then what exactly do you want?" I leaned forward. "First, the fence stays." That confused everyone. Preston frowned. "You want the fence to stay?" "Yep." He looked genuinely relieved for about 3 seconds. Then I continued. "You're going to install a professionally engineered underground water line beneath the development at your expense. Not a temporary solution. Not a patch. A permanent system." The relief vanished. I kept going. "Second, you're granting a new recorded easement with expanded protections that can never be modified without my written approval." One attorney started taking notes faster. "Third, the water capacity will be increased substantially beyond the original flow rate." The title representative sighed because she already knew where this was heading. "And fourth," I said, "you're compensating my ranch for projected livestock and crop losses over the next 2 years." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Preston stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking another language. "You're asking for more than you originally had." "That's right. Why would we agree to that?" Claire finally answered for me. "Because if you don't, discovery continues. The room became very still. Everyone understood what that meant. More documents, more emails, more depositions, more headlines, more uncertainty, more money bleeding out of a project that investors desperately wanted stabilized. The title company representative cleared her throat. From our perspective, resolving this matter permanently is preferable. That was the moment I knew the fight was over. Not because Preston agreed. Not because his lawyers gave up. It was over because the people protecting the money had already chosen a side. 3 days later they signed everything. The engineering work started within a month. By the following spring, a modern underground pipeline delivered more reliable water than the old ditch ever had. The new easement protections were stronger. The flow capacity was greater. The ranch was safer. And the subdivision? Well, it survived too. Families moved in. Kids rode bicycles down the sidewalks. Life went on. Believe it or not, I never hated the homeowners. Most of them had no idea what happened behind the scenes. They simply bought houses and wanted a good place to raise their families. My issue was never with them. It was with the assumption that money and development automatically outrank people who were already there. That assumption shows up all over America these days. Small towns, farming communities, ranch country. Somebody arrives with a big project and starts acting like history began the day they purchased the land. The problem is history has a habit of fighting back, especially when it's recorded at the county courthouse. About a year after everything was settled, I ran into Preston at a local charity event. We hadn't spoken since signing the agreement. He walked over carrying a drink and shook his head with a small laugh. "You know," he said, "that was the most expensive fence I've ever built." I laughed too. "Probably." He looked out across the crowd for a moment. "For what it's worth, I should have handled it differently." I nodded. "Yeah, you should have." Then we both smiled. Not because we became friends. We didn't. But because enough time had passed for both of us to recognize the lesson. He learned that paperwork matters. I learned that patience can be more powerful than anger. And every time I ride across that south pasture and see water moving through that underground system, I think about how close I came to accepting the first offer just to make the problem disappear. If I had, none of the long-term protections would exist today. That's why whenever younger ranchers ask me for advice, I tell them something my father told me years ago. Keep your records, know your rights, and never assume the other side understands either one. Because sometimes people look at a piece of land and see empty space. Sometimes they look at an old irrigation channel and see an inconvenience. But every now and then they discover that what they're really looking at is a line they never should have crossed. Now here's what I'd love to know from you. If you were in my position, would you have accepted the original settlement and moved on, or would you have pushed for the larger agreement the way I did? And on the other side of that question, do you think developers should ever have the power to modify long-standing property rights if they believe it benefits a larger community project? Let me know in the comments because I've seen people argue both sides of this one for years. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who appreciates stories where patience, persistence, and a little bit of small-town justice end up winning the day.